Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're looking at a pretty detailed audit report from February 2025. Think of it as a deep look at how Argentina has been handling its natural gas situation, prices, imports, exports, and that big goal of becoming self-sufficient in hydrocarbons.
Right. And our goal here is really to pull out the key insights, figure out what this audit tells us about Argentina's energy landscape today.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a narrow look, was it? The audit covered several key players.
No, it was quite broad. The National Audit Office, the AGN, looked at the Secretariat of Energy, SE, ENARSA, that's Energy, Argentina SA, and also Enargas, the national gas regulator. So you get a multi-layered perspective.
Good point. And they didn't just skim the surface. They went deep into specific areas like gas pricing.
Yeah, gas pricing and how that affects transport and distribution costs across the country. They also dug into the planning, or maybe lack thereof, for natural gas imports and exports.
And all this connects back to that national objective, right? Hydrocarbon self-sufficiency, which was laid out in Law 26.741.
Exactly. And it's interesting, they also linked it to the bigger picture, looking at progress on Sustainable Development Goal 7. That's the one about affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for everyone.
Which is crucial. Okay, and just for context, this wasn't a quick look. The fieldwork took some time.
Right. The auditors were on the ground between August 30th, 2023 and December 3rd, 2024. So it's fairly recent information we're working with.
Okay, let's get into the substance then. What's the overall energy picture in Argentina look like based on this audit?
Well, the audit makes it pretty clear. Hydrocarbons are dominant. They make up something like 85% of the total energy mix.
Wow, 85%. And gas is a huge part of that.
It really is. Natural gas accounts for over half, more than 50% of Argentina's total energy consumption.
Over half. That's massive.
Yeah.
So how does that play out in, say, electricity generation? That affects everyone directly.
Well, thermal power plants are the main source of electricity, generating over 55%. And guess what fuels most of them?
Natural gas.
You got it. Primarily natural gas, mainly because it's efficient. So you can see this really tight link between the electricity and gas sectors. And natural gas isn't just a fuel source, it's strategically vital for the whole country's energy system.
Okay, so gas is central. How is the sector actually structured? Who does what?
It breaks down into three main segments. First, you've got production, that's finding the gas, getting it out of the ground, treating it. This part, the report says, is largely deregulated.
Okay.
Then there's transportation, basically, the big pipelines moving the gas around. That's regulated as a public service.
And the final step?
That's distribution. The local networks bringing gas to homes and businesses, also a public service, but it's concessioned out to 9 different companies, names you might know, like Metrogas, Nadergy, others.
So it's like a chain reaction, right? Production feeds transport, transport feeds distribution.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the audit really stresses that what happens in one segment directly impacts the others.
Yeah.
You need that holistic view for things to work efficiently. And there's some interesting history there, too. Back in the 90s, there was a push for regional integration, leading to 10 export pipelines being built to Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil. Argentina was actually exporting gas until about 2004.
Wow, an exporter not that long ago puts the current focus on self-sufficiency into perspective. Speaking of which, what's the official national policy aiming for?
Well, the National Executive Power, the PEN, sets the overall hydrocarbon policy. The main goal stated is meeting domestic needs first. And then you have that key law, Law 26.741 from 2012.
Right, the one that declared self-sufficiency a national priority.
Exactly. That's also the law that led to the expropriation of 51% of YPF shares. Its core principles were about maximizing investment for self-sufficiency short, medium, and long term, and also protecting consumers regarding quality and availability.
But the audit mentions a recent change, something about the lay bases.
Yes, that's significant. Article 159 of the lay bases modifies that 2012 law. It still talks about maximizing investment and consumer protection, but it also explicitly promotes hydrocarbon exports to help the balance of payments. And interestingly, a previous criterion about maximizing production compatible with economic exploitation is, well, no longer in effect. It's just maybe a subtle shift, giving exports a bit more prominence alongside self-sufficiency.
Okay, that's a key shift to watch. Now, let's flip to the other side. Demand. What drives gas consumption in Argentina?
The audit breaks it down. A big chunk goes to thermal power generation for electricity. Then you have residential and commercial use, heating, cooking, etc., industrial consumption, compressed natural gas, or GNC for vehicles, and some goes to processing plants outside the main transport system.
And I know firsthand usage definitely swings with the seasons.
Oh, absolutely. Huge seasonal variations. Temperature is the big driver. Heating needs in winter push demand way up. Summer cooling needs can also spike electricity demand, which indirectly hits gas use for power generation.
The report also mentioned something about access to the gas network itself. It's not universal, is it?
No, not at all. The latest INDC census showed only about 48.6% of Argentine households are actually connected to the gas grid.
Less than half.
Yeah, that highlights a really significant portion of the population who aren't connected, likely relying on other, maybe more expensive or less efficient, energy sources like LPG cylinders or electricity for heating. So there's a big unserved demand out there.
Right. Okay, so on the supply side, where's the gas coming from?
Primarily domestic production. It comes from 5 main basins. The Nuquina Basin is the giant, providing around 68% of the total.
68%.
Yeah. Then you've got the Austral Basin down south, Gulf of San Jorge, the Noroeste Basin, and a tiny bit from the Guiana Basin. And this production includes both conventional gas and the increasingly important unconventional sources, shale and tight gas, mainly from Vaca Muerta and the Nuquina Basin.
And the rest is imports, I assume?
Exactly. Historically, imports have come via pipeline from Bolivia and also as liquefied natural gas, LNG, brought in by ship terminals in Bahia Blanca and Escobar. There was also that brief period, 2016-2017, where Argentina imported regasified LNG from Chile, using those export pipelines in reverse, basically.
And has domestic production fluctuated much over time?
Oh yeah, it's been up and down. Lots of factors involved. The natural decline of older fields, various price agreements, those government incentives specifically for unconventional gas.
Which has been important lately.
Hugely important. Also, the availability of transport infrastructure, a recurring theme, shifts in domestic demand, and external factors too, like the declining supply from Bolivia, international conflicts affecting global prices, and even the pandemic. It's a complex mix.
Makes sense. Now, Argentina has tried to boost its own production with incentive policies, right? What's the story there?
Yeah, they've rolled out several plans, especially after 2004 when domestic production started falling. The aim was always to reverse that decline and meet the self-sufficiency goals of Law 26.741.
Like Plan Gas.
Right. Plan Gas Version 2 offered incentives, basically paying a premium price, $7.5 per MMBTU for gas produced above a certain baseline. They were focused on companies already producing. Plan Gas Off made investment plans mandatory for some.
And then Resolution 46.
That one specifically targeted unconventional gas in the Nuquina and Austral basins, trying to fast-track development there. But probably the most significant recent one is Plan Gas.R, started under Decree 899220.
That sounds more comprehensive.
It was. Broader scope, covered all basins. The goals were pretty wide-ranging. Encourage investment, protect users, substitute imports, generate exportable surpluses, and provide some long-term certainty.
How did it work?
It set a base volume, about 70 million cubic meters per day across the basins, and even allowed for preferential export conditions in the summer. Companies bid by offering volumes, prices, and importantly, investment plans.
And it focused on local content, too.
Yes, a key part was prioritizing local, regional, and national employment, tech, and goods services. They even set up a working group, the VAN, Valor Agregado Nacional, to track those investment commitments.
Did that plan get modified later on?
It did. Decree 730222 brought changes. It added winter exports as a goal, explicitly linked it to expanding transport capacity to all basins, extended the plan's validity to 2028, allowed for more bidding rounds, set a minimum price for export authorizations, and tweaked the investment plan requirements.
So a few rounds of bidding happened under these plans.
That's right. The audit period saw 4 rounds, 3 under the original Plan Gas R decree, and 2 after the modifications. These rounds awarded specific volumes at specific prices to various producers. The report gives some examples of the weighted average prices, like around $3.5 per MMBTU in some rounds.
And to deal with the transport bottleneck we keep mentioning, there was the Transport.R program.
Yes, crucial step. Resolution SE 6722 created transport, are specifically to boost pipeline capacity. It declared the Presidente Néstor Kirchner gas pipeline, the GPNK, a matter of national public interest. This was direct recognition that lack of transport, especially out of Nuquina, was holding back production growth.
Okay, so we have these efforts to boost supply and build infrastructure. How well have national production and domestic demand actually matched up? That's the core of self-sufficiency, right?
It absolutely is. The audit points out several factors influencing this balance. Where the gas basins are, the size of reserves, how much it costs to extract, gas prices both domestically and internationally, the state of the transport and distribution infrastructure, and where the main consumption centers are located. Plus, that big seasonal demand swing.
Sounds like a constant juggling act.
It really is. You're trying to match supply with a demand that's influenced by consumer habits, technology, the overall economy, temperature swings, and even unexpected events like the pandemic.
And the geography doesn't help.
No, the fact that the big production areas, like New Guinea, are far from the big consumption centers like Buenos Aires just highlights how incredibly vital that transport infrastructure is. We keep coming back to it.
Right. Without the pipelines, more production doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Does the report go into more detail on the transport system itself?
It does. While transport and distribution are regulated public services, the audit flags the transport companies aren't actually obligated to invest in expanding capacity. Expansion is more seen as a business opportunity if the market grows.
Ah, okay.
The problem, highlighted by the report, was that the production increases spurred by incentives like Resolution 46 back in 2018-2019 started to really saturate the existing pipelines, especially from New Guinea, during those peak winter demand months.
And that's where the GP&K pipeline idea came from.
Exactly. It was planned as the major solution to get that Vaca Muerta gas out of New Guinea and up towards Buenos Aires and the littoral region. There were initial calls for interest, an international tender process, but it faced delays and rethinking.
Until transport.R.
Right. Resolution SE 6722 formally created the transport.R program and declared the GP&K project of national interest precisely because the existing pipelines out of New Guinea were basically hitting their limit.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about Argentina's role internationally? Exports and imports. What's the framework for exports?
Well, the Basic Hydrocarbons Law, 17.319, gives the PEN the power to set national policy. Then Law 24.076 stated that the PEN has to authorize exports, but critically, only if domestic supply isn't harmed. It also required companies to submit export contracts to INARJAS. Over the years, various decrees and resolutions added layers, procedures for permits, automatic approval under certain conditions, rules for temporary or emergency exports where the gas had to be reimported later. And the recent Lena basis has brought further changes, which the report notes are being looked at separately.
And the history of exports, we touched on this.
Yeah, Argentina peaked in gas production and exports around 2004. But then as domestic demand rose and production fell, the report mentions a 20% drop between 2004 and 2014. Exports were heavily restricted.
Does the audit mention LNG exports specifically?
It does briefly. A 2019 regulation adapted the rules for liquid fuel export contracts to specifically include LNG, acknowledging its growing role globally.
Okay, so the flip side, imports. What's the general policy there?
Traditionally, hydrocarbon imports have been relatively free, with the main requirement being submitting import contracts to an Argus. Though, again, the Lady Basis recently repealed that specific article of Law 24.076. The PEN still sets the overall import regulations under Law 17.319.
And Argentina has that long-standing import relationship with Bolivia, right?
Correct. Since 2004, there have been various agreements, starting temporary and evolving into a long-term purchase agreement between INARSA and YPFB, Bolivia's state gas company. This contract has seen multiple extensions and amendments over the years.
And LNG imports became increasingly important.
Absolutely. They really ramped up as a way to cover domestic supply shortfalls. INARSA handles the procurement now, having taken over from YPF in 2016. Argentina uses two main regasification terminals, Bahia Blanca and Escobar.
Are they run by INARSA?
They're operated by joint ventures between INARSA and YPF. The Bahia Blanca one is older, stemming from a 2008 contract involving YPF. Each terminal has different storage and injection capacities, which the report details, how much gas they can put into the system per day.
And those temporary imports from Chile.
Right. Back in 2016-2017, that was regasified. LNG imported via those old export pipelines, mainly to displace more expensive diesel fuel used in power plants during high demand periods. There was even a framework supply contract between the former IESA and Chile's INAPI from 2018-2020, sort of as an emergency backup option.
Okay, let's talk about something that hits home for consumers. Gas prices.
Yeah.
What's the guiding regulatory principle supposed to be?
Well, the basic idea is that prices should ideally come from the free interplay of supply and demand. and distributors are just supposed to pass through their gas purchase costs to end users without making a profit or loss on the gas commodity itself.
But we know there's been a lot of government intervention over the years, especially after the 2002 crisis.
You're right. The public emergency declared under Law 25.561 allowed the government to intervene in tariffs and contracts, and that power was extended multiple times, right up till 2017. There were also specific decrees creating an electronic gas market, MEGSA, and regulating prices at the entry point to the transport system, PIS, often prioritizing certain users.
And then there were those tariff reviews that got stopped by the courts.
Yes, the inter-tariff reviews, or RTIs, started by Enargus in 2016, were ultimately annulled by the Supreme Court's CEPIS ruling. That ruling mandated public hearings before any new tariff scheme could be implemented.
I remember those hearings. What were the producers arguing for?
Generally, in those 2016-2017 hearings, producers argued they needed higher wellhead prices, the price at the point of production, to make investments in boosting gas supply economically viable. This led to agreements called bases y condiciones with the government, setting a path for gradual price increases in U.S. dollars through 2019.
The report also flags the impact of currency fluctuations, something Argentines know all too well.
Absolutely. Big swings in the exchange rate in 2018 created major gaps between the gas prices contracted in U.S. dollars and the prices actually recognized in consumer tariffs. This led to a scramble of resolutions and ultimately a decree where the national government temporarily stepped in to cover the difference caused by that currency volatility, though that decree was later repealed.
Sounds like a constant struggle to balance producer needs, consumer affordability, and market realities. Did the report mention other pricing mechanisms, like Resolution 3219?
Yeah, that resolution tried to set up a mechanism to ensure gas supply by applying certain rules about daily accumulated differences, the DDAs. But NRGL later scrapped that methodology. And then, of course, Law 27.541 in late 2019 brought in a tariff freeze and allowed the PE to start a whole new tariff review process while existing supply agreements were extended.
So the final cost of gas is made up of a few things then: domestic production, Bolivian imports, and LNG imports.
That's right. The price of domestic gas is influenced by all the factors we discussed. The Bolivian gas price is set by that specific INARSA YPFB contract, and the cost of imported LNG is determined by INARSA's procurement processes on the international market.
Now, the audit also checked if the organizations were actually following the rules. What did they find regarding compliance?
Regarding Law 24.076, which required importers and exporters to submit contracts to Enargas, the AGN confirmed that Enargas did receive these contracts. However, regarding an older decree, 141.194, which instructed Enargas to certify gas purchase operations under a deregulation decree, Enargas reported that no data exchange was happening under that framework anymore, though they did provide info on those daily accumulated differences, the DDAs.
And did the auditors follow up on any previous recommendations from an earlier AGN report in 2021?
Yes, they did. INARSA reported they had set up a quality control system for documentation and provided details on their LNG purchasing process. They also describe how they internally track gas purchase and sale operations and the related finances. On the question of extending a previous energy program or formally regulating gas imports, INARSA stated the program wasn't extended and that instructions from the Secretariat of Energy basically serve as the legal framework for their import activities.
The report also connects back to Argentina's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 7 on energy. How did the audit view the link between hydrocarbon policy and these global goals?
Well, Argentina signed on to the 2030 Agenda back in 2015. SDG 7 is all about affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. The audit notes that Argentina's own hydrocarbon laws, like 17.319 and 26.741, actually echo these goals by aiming to meet domestic energy needs and protect consumer interests regarding quality and availability.
But did the audit find challenges in actually planning to meet those needs, especially regarding imports?
That's a key finding, yes. The Secretariat of Energy is supposed to coordinate the process of figuring out import needs. While different areas within the SE did produce forecasts, the audit found a lack of a standardized, formally documented methodology for short, medium, and long-term supply planning.
So, no clear, consistent process.
It seems not. This made it harder to have a predictable and effective approach to ensuring adequate gas supplies. There were also mentions that the procedures used for buying LNG were often seen as exceptional, kind of waiting for clearer, permanent regulations.
And the report mentioned something called the Mesa de Invierno, the winter table.
Yes, the AGN looked at minutes from these meetings. They were basically forums to discuss supply issues during the peak winter demand season, covering demand forecasts, domestic production, import volumes, transport capacity, things like that.
Sounds useful.
Potentially. But the audit noted the minutes were pretty basic, just Word documents without formal records of specific problems identified, solutions proposed, or concrete recommendations agreed upon.
So maybe a lack of formal follow-through. It seems like better coordination was needed.
That appears to be the implication. And RGAS, the regulator, had even proposed creating a formal operations committee for gas supply and demand to improve coordination across the sector. The SE responded by setting up a working group for information sharing. The audit also pointed out that Enargas had to convene its emergency committee numerous times in 2016-2017 due to various supply risks, suggesting vulnerabilities in the system at that time.
Okay, so after this really detailed examination, what were the main shortcomings the audit actually identified, the key deficiencies?
They highlighted several critical areas. First, a lack of formal supply planning. The absence of a regulated, documented procedure for planning gas supply and import needs was seen as a major weakness, hindering effective and predictable supply.
Right. What else?
Second, inconsistent incentive policy design. Earlier programs like Plan Gas Third and Resolution 46 were found lacking in clear goal setting, justification for the incentive prices offered, how volumes were allocated, and effective control mechanisms. Plan Gas R was seen as an improvement, but the audit still questioned the basis for the stimulus and maximum prices, suggesting a lack of robust analysis.
So concerns about whether those incentives provided good value.
Pretty much. The SE even reported lacking ways to fully know the actual costs of gas production, and the audit couldn't find specific IT tools or indicators being used to systematically measure how effective these expensive incentive programs really were.
Okay, what other major findings?
Continued dependence on imports. Despite the incentives, domestic supply still relied significantly on imports. Although the trend was downward, imports still made up about 11% relative to domestic production during the period. Linked to this was the negative impact of LNG imports on the trade balance. Even as import volumes decreased somewhat, the shift towards more expensive LNG, especially with global prices spiking in 2021 due to the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, actually worsened Argentina's gas trade deficit.
So importing less gas but paying much more for it?
Exactly. Then there was the insufficient transport infrastructure planning. The lack of coordination between production incentives and building the necessary pipelines led to those bottlenecks, especially from Vaca Muerta, hindering the self-sufficiency goal. The GP&K pipeline was deemed necessary but faced those significant delays.
And demand issues.
Yes, stagnant demand among served users, coupled with very low expansion of service to the large unserved population. Remember that only 48.6% household access figure, while a program called Plan-ACERC.AR gas helped finance some distribution network extensions, it didn't tackle the core transport limitations needed for broader access.
The report also flagged those U.S. dollar-denominated gas supply agreements again.
It did. The bases y condiciones, setting supply prices to distributors in USD, led to those massive daily accumulated differences, DDAs, in 2018 when the exchange rate blew out, requiring state intervention. The audit noted these agreements were made after the public emergency declaration had ended, potentially conflicting with regulations like Law 24.076.
And a mismatch between incentive prices and market prices.
Right. Later auctions actually resulted in market prices lower than the levels set by some earlier incentive schemes, suggesting potential overpayment through those incentives. The audit found that the rising domestic gas prices, boosted by incentives, ended up exceeding both international gas prices and the average cost of imported gas.
Wow. And finally, SDG 7.
The audit concluded there was limited progress on SDG 7, particularly regarding universal access to affordable, reliable energy. Transport network expansion just hadn't kept pace with population growth, leaving many reliant on less efficient, costlier alternatives like LPG or electricity for basic needs. Plan-ACERC gas helped some, but wasn't enough to fundamentally change the picture.
Okay, so given all these findings, what did the audit actually recommend? Who are the recommendations for?
They were directed mainly at the Secretariat of Energy, ENARSA, and Enargas. Key recommendations included formalizing that procedure for gas supply and import needs planning with clear timelines and responsibilities.
Makes sense. Address the planning gap.
Exactly. Also, developing a clear methodology to determine incentive and maximum gas prices, supported by solid technical and economic analysis of production costs. And implementing a comprehensive system for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of those gas production incentive programs.
So more transparency and data-driven decisions needed there.
Precisely. Other major recommendations were to define and implement a long-term plan for transport infrastructure expansion that's actually aligned with production goals and demand forecasts. Also, to design and implement policies specifically aimed at promoting access to gas networks for unserved populations, directly contributing to SDG 7.
And addressing the currency risk.
Yes, ensuring future gas supply agreements consider exchange rate risks to avoid repeating those huge financial imbalances that needed government bailouts.
Okay, so summing up, it sounds like Argentina's path to gas self-sufficiency faces some pretty significant hurdles. Planning, infrastructure, aligning incentives with market realities. It's complex.
That's a fair summary. The audit really lays bare the complexities and highlights a clear need for more strategic, coordinated approaches across the entire energy sector.
It seems like just boosting production isn't the whole answer. You absolutely need that robust, adaptable infrastructure and a really clear grasp of both domestic needs and global energy economics. It really makes you wonder, what are the next steps needed to bridge these gaps and secure a genuinely sustainable energy future for Argentina?
This audit certainly provides a valuable roadmap for those next steps, pinpointing the key areas that demand attention and, frankly, more effective policymaking.
Thanks for listening to Geopolitica, a podcast by Enrico Relli. Don't forget to provide financial support and spread the word about this podcast.